On the morning of January 30th, 1933, Berlin did not look like a city on the brink of catastrophe. There were no barricades in the streets, no tanks, no firing squads. Trams ran on time. Shops opened their doors. Newspapers were delivered as usual. Inside government buildings, men in dark coats discussed appointments, coalitions, procedures, all the dull, respectable mechanics of a functioning state. By evening, Adolf Hitler would be Chancellor of Germany. Not by force, not by revolution, but by signature. That is what makes this day dangerous, because dictatorships are easy to recognize when they arrive screaming. Democracies do not collapse that way. They collapse quietly, through meetings, compromises, and promises that everything is temporary. Germany in 1933 was not a failed state. It was a wounded one. 14 years after defeat in World War I, the country was exhausted. Hyperinflation had destroyed savings. The Great Depression had shattered what little stability remained. 6 million people were unemployed. Faith in political parties had eroded into contempt. Parliament still met, but fewer Germans believed it could solve anything. Democracy had not failed loudly. It had failed slowly. And when people stop believing in democratic institutions, they do not demand tyranny. They demand order. Hitler did not seize that moment by accident. He arrived not as a revolutionary outsider, but as a man invited inside by conservatives who believed they could use him, control him, contain him. They told themselves the same reassuring lies that echo through history. He will calm down once he has responsibility. We can always remove him later. This is better than chaos. President Paul von Hindenburg did not think he was signing Germany's death warrant when he appointed Hitler chancellor. He thought he was solving a political crisis. Franz von Papen believed Hitler would be boxed in by experienced elites. Industrialists believed stability mattered more than principles. Millions of ordinary Germans believed it could not get worse. No laws were abolished that day. No constitution was suspended. No opposition party was outlawed. Everything still looked legal. That is the trap. Democracy rarely dies in a single moment. It dies when fear becomes more persuasive than freedom. When people agree to surrender rights, not forever, but just until the crisis passes. January 30th, 1933 was not the end of the Weimar Republic. It was the moment it stopped being able to defend itself. And almost no one noticed. On paper, the appointment of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933 looked almost banal. No emergency decree was issued. No constitution was torn apart. No tanks surrounded the Reichstag. The document bore a signature, a seal, and a date. It followed procedure. It respected form. It complied with the rules of the Weimar Republic. The same democratic system that had been created after Germany's defeat in World War I to prevent exactly what was about to happen. This was not a coup. It was an appointment. And that distinction mattered, because it shaped how Germans understood what was happening. Many did not feel conquered. They felt relieved. By early 1933, Germany was trapped in political paralysis. Elections came and went. Governments rose and collapsed. Coalitions formed and disintegrated. Parliament existed, but it no longer governed in any meaningful sense. Emergency decrees issued by the president had become routine. Democracy still functioned, but on life support. The Great Depression had hit Germany with brutal force. By the winter of 1932 to 1933, more than 6 million Germans were unemployed. Entire regions were drowning in poverty. Soup kitchens replaced factories. Veterans begged in the streets. Middle-class families, who had survived the hyperinflation of the early 1920s, now watched their savings evaporate for a second time. Faith in the system eroded, not because Germans suddenly rejected democracy as an idea, but because democracy no longer seemed capable of delivering stability. This is the context that made Hitler possible. The Nazi Party had become the largest party in the Reichstag by July 1932, though it never achieved an outright majority. Its support was broad but volatile. A coalition of the desperate, the angry, the frightened, and the opportunistic. Nazis promised work, national revival, and an end to humiliation. They spoke in absolutes, in enemies and destiny, in certainties that parliamentary debate could not offer. Still, Hitler failed to secure power through elections alone. He ran for president against Paul von Hindenburg and lost. He demanded the chancellorship and was rejected. For months, he remained a loud, dangerous presence, but not the man in charge. What changed was not Hitler. It was the calculation of the elites around him. Germany's conservative establishment feared two things above all else: communism and chaos. They despised Hitler's vulgarity, his mass rallies, his demagoguery, but they believed they could control him. Worse, they believed they needed him. At the center of this illusion stood Franz von Papen, a former chancellor himself. Papen was convinced that Hitler could be harnessed like a tool, his popular support used to stabilize the system, while real power remained in the hands of traditional elites, landowners, industrialists, military leaders, and the presidency. Papen reportedly boasted that within weeks, Hitler would be boxed in so tightly that he'll squeal. It was one of the most catastrophic misjudgments of the 20th century. On January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor at the head of a coalition government. Only 3 of the 11 cabinet ministers were Nazis. Key ministries, the army, the economy, foreign affairs, remained in conservative hands. Papen became vice-chancellor, confidently positioning himself as the man who would keep Hitler in check. From the outside, it looked like compromise. From the inside, it was surrender disguised as pragmatism. Many Germans welcomed the decision. They did not see it as the end of democracy, but as an attempt to save it from paralysis. Newspapers spoke of stability. Business leaders spoke of order. Ordinary citizens spoke of hope that the endless crisis might finally end. Hitler himself understood the power of legality better than his opponents did. He did not march into office threatening revolution. He wore a suit. He shook hands. He posed for photographs with Hindenburg. He spoke of national unity and constitutional order. He assured conservatives that he respected the state and would govern responsibly. This performance mattered because legality creates legitimacy. When power is acquired through recognized institutions, resistance feels unnecessary, even unreasonable. After all, if the system itself has spoken, who are you to object? The tragedy of January 30th is that nothing appeared broken. The Constitution still existed. Political parties still operated. Courts still functioned. The press still published criticism. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The chancellorship gave Hitler access to the bureaucracy, the police, the machinery of state. It allowed him to move from agitator to administrator, from outsider to authority. The very system designed to protect democracy now shielded its most dangerous enemy. And crucially, Hitler did not need absolute power immediately. He needed time. Time to normalize his presence. Time to exploit fear. Time to turn temporary measures into permanent ones. Democracy's greatest weakness is not that it tolerates enemies. It is that it assumes those enemies will play by its rules. Within days of taking office, Hitler called for new elections, scheduled for March 1933. The goal was simple: secure a stronger parliamentary position while appearing to act within constitutional boundaries. There was no ban on opposition parties, no suspension of voting rights. Everything still followed procedure. But the atmosphere had changed. Nazi paramilitaries were increasingly tolerated by police. Political opponents faced intimidation. Violence became selective, then routine. The state did not collapse into terror overnight. It leaned toward it, quietly, incrementally. Most Germans did not protest. Why would they? The government was legal. The measures were justified. The crisis was real. And always, there was the same promise. This is temporary. Temporary emergency powers, temporary restrictions, temporary sacrifices for national survival. History shows that societies rarely notice the moment when temporary becomes permanent. By the time the illusion dissolves, resistance is no longer possible without enormous cost. January 30th, 1933, was not the day Germany chose dictatorship. It was the day Germany accepted the logic that made dictatorship possible. The illusion of control, that dangerous belief shared by politicians, businessmen, judges, and voters alike, rested on one fatal assumption: that the rules themselves would restrain those who despised them. They were wrong. Hitler did not need to destroy democracy immediately. He only needed to step inside it. And once inside, the system that had invited him in would find itself unable to push him back out. The death of democracy does not begin with violence. It begins with trust placed in the wrong hands, and the comforting belief that the system will protect itself. Germany would soon learn how fragile that belief truly was. On the night of February 27, 1933, flames tore through the Reichstag building in Berlin. The fire did not destroy German democracy by itself, but it gave those in power the excuse they had been waiting for. By the time dawn broke over the smoking ruins of Parliament, the narrative was already set. This was not an accident. It was not an isolated act. It was, according to the government, the opening strike of a communist revolution. Fear moved faster than facts. Within hours, police arrested a young Dutch drifter, Marinus van der Lubbe, found wandering inside the building. He confessed to setting the fire alone, a claim that would later fuel endless debate. Was he a lone arsonist? A pawn? A convenient scapegoat? The historical argument still continues. But in February 1933, none of that mattered. What mattered was the story. And the story was simple. Germany was under attack from within. For a society already exhausted by years of crisis, the fire felt like confirmation of every fear. Communists had been warning of revolution. Nazis had been warning of chaos. Now, it seemed, chaos had arrived, right at the heart of government. Hitler acted immediately. The next day, President Paul von Hindenburg signed the Decree for the Protection of People and State. It was presented as an emergency measure, a temporary suspension of certain rights to deal with an existential threat. The decree did not abolish the Constitution. It simply set it aside. Freedom of speech was restricted. Freedom of the press was curtailed. Freedom of assembly was suspended. Privacy of mail and telephone communications was eliminated. Most crucially, the police were granted sweeping powers to detain individuals indefinitely without trial. All of this was legal. The Weimar Constitution contained emergency provisions designed for moments of national danger. The assumption behind them was rational. In extreme circumstances, a democratic state must be able to defend itself. What the Constitution did not anticipate was a government that would manufacture or exploit permanent emergency. The Reichstag fire decree was framed as a defensive act. It was sold as protection. It was justified as necessity. And it worked, because it aligned perfectly with public emotion. People were afraid. Fear does not demand evidence. Fear demands action. Communist offices were raided. Party newspapers were shut down. Thousands of political opponents were arrested within days. Many were beaten. Some were killed. Most Germans did not see these events directly. They read about them, if they read about them at all, through newspapers now under growing pressure to conform. To those not targeted, the repression felt distant, abstract, even reasonable. After all, if you were not a communist, what did you have to fear? This is how selective repression functions. It divides society into categories of safety, and danger. It reassures the majority by sacrificing a minority. And it relies on a silent calculation. Better them than me. The upcoming elections of March 5, 1933 were supposed to restore stability. Hitler promised a decisive mandate from the people. Technically, the elections were still free. Practically, they were not. Opposition parties could still exist, but their meetings were disrupted. Their leaders were arrested or intimidated. Their newspapers were censored. Nazi paramilitaries operated openly, often with police cooperation. Violence became a political tool, unevenly applied and officially ignored. Yet ballots were printed, polling stations opened, voters lined up, democracy, again, looked intact. The results did not give the Nazis an absolute majority. Even under conditions of terror and suppression, a significant portion of the population still voted against them. But combined with their conservative allies, Hitler now controlled enough of the Reichstag to move to the next phase. This is where the illusion of legality reached its most lethal form. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag convened under extraordinary circumstances. Communist deputies were absent, many imprisoned, others in hiding. Armed stormtroopers surrounded the building. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, charged, unmistakably threatening. The bill presented that day was called the Enabling Act. Its language was deliberately restrained. It did not declare dictatorship. It did not abolish Parliament outright. It simply transferred legislative power from the Reichstag to the government, including the right to pass laws that deviated from the Constitution. For 4 years, temporarily. This was the moment when democracy did not merely bend, it voted to disarm itself. The Enabling Act required a 2/3 majority to pass. That meant cooperation from non-Nazi parties, and some of them complied. Why? Some believed resistance would provoke civil war. Some believed compromise could limit the damage. Some believed the act would stabilize the country and then expire. They were wrong. When the vote was taken, the Enabling Act passed. The remaining Social Democrats voted against it, bravely and uselessly. Their leader warned that freedom could be taken, but honor could not. Within months, his party would be banned. With that vote, the legal foundation of the Weimar Republic collapsed, not through force, but through procedure. The Reichstag did not explode. It applauded. What followed came quickly. Political parties were dissolved. Trade unions were crushed. Independent media vanished. Courts were brought into line. The state absorbed society, and dissent became treason. Still, many Germans did not rebel, because none of this happened all at once, because each step was justified by crisis, because each restriction had precedent, because each sacrifice was framed as necessary, and because the promise of order proved intoxicating. The tragedy of early 1933 is not that Germans were uniquely cruel or ignorant. It is that they were human, susceptible to fear, fatigue, and hope that someone, finally, was in control. Dictatorship did not arrive as a monster. It arrived as a solution. By the time it revealed its true face, it was already too late to look away. The fire in the Reichstag did not burn democracy down in a single night. It burned the last excuses. And from the ashes, a system emerged that no longer needed to pretend it was temporary. On March 23, 1933, the German parliament gathered to decide its own fate. The building was the Kroll Opera House, not the Reichstag itself. The Reichstag still stood blackened and hollow after the fire. The relocation was presented as practical. In reality, it was symbolic. Democracy no longer met in its own home. Outside, columns of armed stormtroopers lined the streets. Inside, uniformed Nazis filled the galleries. Their presence was legal, intimidating, but legal. Violence did not need to be used. It only needed to be visible. This was not chaos. It was choreography. The law introduced that day was called the Law to Remedy the Distress of People in Reich, better known to history as the Enabling Act. Its language was calm, technical, almost dull. It did not proclaim dictatorship. It did not abolish elections. It did not declare the end of democracy. It simply transferred legislative power from Parliament to the Cabinet. For 4 years. Temporarily. Under the Act, the government could pass laws without parliamentary approval, even laws that violated the Constitution. The Reichstag would still exist. It would still meet. It would still vote. It would just no longer matter. To pass, the Enabling Act required a 2/3 majority. That meant Hitler could not succeed alone. He needed votes from the very institutions democracy relied upon for its defense, and he knew exactly how to get them. When Adolf Hitler addressed the deputies, he did not sound like a tyrant. He sounded like a statesman, measured, conciliatory, reassuring. He promised stability. He promised respect for Christianity. He promised cooperation with the states. He promised that Parliament would continue to exist. Most importantly, he promised that the emergency would end. This was not a threat. It was an offer. Vote yes, and the chaos ends. Vote no, and responsibility for what follows will be yours. The atmosphere in the hall made clear what follows might mean. Communist deputies were absent, arrested, hiding, or already in early concentration camps, euphemistically labeled protective custody. Their absence alone altered the arithmetic of democracy. This, too, was legal. Emergency powers allowed it. Some deputies understood exactly what was happening. Others understood only vaguely. Many preferred not to understand at all, because understanding would require action, and action carried risk. The most important votes that day did not come from Nazis. They came from conservatives, centrists, and nationalists who believed they were acting responsibly. Their logic followed a familiar pattern. Germany, they argued, was facing an existential crisis. Parliamentary government had failed. Communism threatened revolution. Violence filled the streets. Order had to be restored. Extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. They did not see themselves as destroying democracy. They saw themselves as suspending it, briefly, to save the nation. This is the psychology that ends republics. The conservative elite believed they were still in control. They believed Hitler depended on them. They believed the presidency, the courts, the army, and traditional institutions would restrain excess. Most of all, they believed in their own importance. Authoritarian movements thrive on this illusion, that experienced men of power will always be needed, that radicals can be used, moderated, discarded. They were wrong. Once power is centralized, intermediaries become obstacles, and obstacles are removed. The Catholic Center Party held the balance. Its leadership hesitated. They negotiated. They extracted assurances, verbal promises that church rights would be respected, that federalism would remain, that Parliament would not be abolished outright. These promises were not written into the law, but they were accepted. Because in moments of fear, promises feel like anchors. When the vote was called, the Center Party voted in favor. This was the decisive moment. It was not done out of fanaticism. It was done out of caution. And caution proved fatal. Only one party stood openly against the Enabling Act, the Social Democrats. Their leader, Otto Wels, delivered a speech that history would later remember as one of the last free voices of the Weimar Republic. He did not insult. He did not threaten. He did not plead. He stated a simple truth. Freedom could be taken, but dignity could not be surrendered. His words were met with jeers. The vote was already decided. When the ballots were counted, the Enabling Act passed by an overwhelming majority. There was no explosion, no dramatic collapse, no visible end. Applause followed. The Reichstag had voted itself into irrelevance. This was the most dangerous moment in the death of German democracy, not because it was violent, but because it was consensual. Everything had been done correctly. The president had signed. The parliament had voted. The Constitution had been temporarily overridden by constitutional means. There was no obvious point at which resistance could easily justify itself. The system had spoken, even as it dismantled itself. This is how legality becomes a weapon. When repression is lawful, protest feels radical. When injustice wears a uniform of procedure, opposition appears unreasonable. Many Germans told themselves that the essentials of democracy remained intact. The Reichstag still existed. Elections would return. The courts still functioned. The press still published cautiously. They told themselves this was not dictatorship. They were confusing form with substance. What followed happened faster than most expected. Within weeks, state governments were purged. Civil servants were dismissed for political unreliability. Trade unions were dissolved. Opposition parties were banned or forced to disband themselves. Each step was justified by law passed under the Enabling Act. Each step appeared orderly. Each step narrowed the space for resistance. Those who had voted yes found themselves sidelined, then silenced. Their usefulness had expired. The box they believed they had built around Hitler now enclosed them. The presidency became ceremonial. Parliament became theater. The judiciary adjusted itself to the new reality. Bureaucracy learned the language of obedience. And still, many Germans adapted. Because adaptation is easier than resistance. Because daily life continued. Because the trains still ran. Dictatorship did not announce itself with a single proclamation. It revealed itself through absence. The absence of alternatives, of criticism, of meaningful choice. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of March 23, 1933, is that many believed they still had time. 4 years, they told themselves. The law expires. Normality returns. But power, once centralized, does not return itself voluntarily. Emergency becomes routine. Exception becomes rule. Temporary becomes permanent. By the time the illusion shattered, opposition no longer had institutions, leaders, or legal tools left to use. Democracy had not been overthrown. It had been authorized to disappear. The Enabling Act was not merely a Nazi victory. It was a collective failure of imagination, courage, and responsibility. It showed that democracies do not collapse because people stop believing in freedom, but because they believe freedom can wait. That order must come first. That stability is neutral. That legality equals legitimacy. History would prove how wrong these assumptions were. March the 23rd, 1933 was the day the Weimar Republic still existed and no longer mattered. The vote ended debate, ended accountability, and ended the possibility of lawful resistance. What remained was power without restraint, and a society that had voted to trust it. Why most people did nothing. When historians ask why dictatorships succeed, the question is often framed incorrectly. It is not. Why did people support it? It is. Why did so many people accept it? Germany in 1933 was not a nation of fanatics. It was a nation of exhausted citizens trying to survive. And for most of them, the collapse of democracy did not feel like a dramatic event. It felt like background noise. Life did not stop. People still went to work, if they had work. Children still went to school. Shops still sold bread. Weddings were still celebrated. Football matches were still played. Radio programs still aired music and entertainment. There was no single moment when the average German woke up and said, "Today, I lost my freedom." Freedom disappeared the way daylight fades, gradually, unevenly, almost imperceptibly. One of the most persistent myths about Nazi Germany is that the population was uniformly enthusiastic, that millions cheered, marched, and believed. Some did. Many did not. The truth is more unsettling. Most people adjusted. They did not resist because resistance seemed unnecessary, or dangerous, or pointless, or simply irrelevant to daily survival. Dictatorships do not require mass belief. They require mass accommodation. The Nazi regime understood this instinctively. It did not initially demand fanatic loyalty from everyone. It demanded compliance, silence, normalization, and that was easier than people like to admit. Repression in early 1933 was selective. Communists were arrested first, then Social Democrats, then trade union leaders, then journalists, then intellectuals. For the majority, these groups were others. If you were a shopkeeper, a farmer, a clerk, a housewife, you could tell yourself that politics was not your business, that those arrested had done something wrong, that extreme measures were aimed at extremists. This psychological mechanism is ancient and powerful. As long as repression targets a minority, the majority feels safer, not threatened. Fear is outsourced. They must have provoked it. They are radicals. It's unfortunate, but necessary. Each arrest that did not include you reinforced the illusion that you were safe, until one day no one was. One of the reasons democratic collapse feels unreal is that it rarely happens all at once. Had Hitler abolished all parties on January 31st, 1933, resistance might have been immediate. Had newspapers been shut down overnight, outrage might have followed. Instead, change came in increments. A decree here, a regulation there, a newspaper temporarily suspended, a meeting quietly banned, a teacher reassigned, a neighbor dismissed. Each step was small enough to tolerate. People are remarkably adaptable. We recalibrate our sense of normal constantly. What would have shocked us yesterday becomes routine tomorrow. This is not weakness. It is survival instinct, but regimes exploit it mercilessly. Another misconception is that people were constantly terrified. They were not at first. Early Nazi Germany did not resemble a society under total terror. The violence was real, but uneven. Visible enough to intimidate, limited enough to normalize. Fear functions statistically, not universally. You did not need to see someone beaten. You only needed to know it could happen. And uncertainty is more effective than constant brutality. If everyone is punished, outrage grows. If some are punished, silence spreads. People learned the new rules quickly. Don't speak openly. Don't attract attention. Don't defend the wrong people. Self-censorship replaced censorship. And it worked. The Nazi regime delivered something desperately needed: the appearance of economic improvement. Public works programs expanded. Unemployment numbers began to fall. Rearmament created jobs. Confidence, or at least momentum, returned. For people who had suffered years of humiliation and poverty, this mattered more than abstract freedoms. Bread feels more real than constitutions. The moral trade-off was not experienced as betrayal, but as relief. Finally, someone is doing something. When survival improves, questions fade. Totalitarian systems do not rule only through fear. They rule through inclusion. Rallies, uniforms, symbols, rituals, all created a sense of participation. Even those who were not true believers could feel swept into something larger than themselves. Belonging is intoxicating, especially in societies fractured by crisis. Loneliness disappears. Uncertainty is replaced by identity. Complexity is replaced by clarity. You are no longer just a person struggling in a broken system. You are part of a movement, a nation, a destiny. Opting out required emotional courage and social isolation. Most people chose connection. By 1933, Germans were tired. They were tired of elections that solved nothing, tired of governments that collapsed, tired of debates while lives deteriorated. Democracy demands patience. Crisis destroys it. Authoritarianism offers speed, not justice, not wisdom, speed. For exhausted societies, speed feels like competence. Even people who distrusted the Nazis often told themselves, "Let them try. If it fails, we'll stop them." They underestimated how quickly stopping would become impossible. Many Germans believed that as long as they stayed out of politics, their private lives would remain untouched. This belief was not irrational at first. The regime encouraged it. You could read novels, listen to music, go on vacation, raise your children, love, marry, celebrate, as long as you conformed outwardly. This division between public obedience and private life created a dangerous comfort zone. Politics became something external, abstract, not urgent. By the time the regime reached into private life, the habit of compliance was deeply ingrained. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of societal adaptation is how quickly moral boundaries shift. Things that once felt unacceptable became debatable. Things that once felt debatable became normal. Things that once felt normal became invisible. Language changed first. Enemies replaced opponents. Purity replaced pluralism. Security replaced liberty. Words softened reality, and reality followed. People did not wake up cruel. They learned to stop noticing. Most Germans were neither perpetrators nor heroes. They were bystanders. And bystanders always have reasons. I can't change anything. It's dangerous to speak. Others know better. I have a family to protect. At least it's not as bad as before. These are not excuses invented later. They are the quiet thoughts that keep societies functional under authoritarianism. They are understandable. That is why they are so dangerous. Resistance requires three things: information, organization, and hope. By mid-1933, all three were gone. Independent media was crushed. Opposition organizations were dismantled. Legal pathways were closed. Even those who recognized what was happening found themselves isolated, uncertain, afraid, not of immediate death, but of social and professional annihilation. Heroism is rare, not because people are evil, but because courage without support feels suicidal. By the time many Germans realized what they had lost, the loss had already reshaped them. They spoke differently. They thought differently. They avoided differently. The absence of freedom became familiar, and familiarity breeds acceptance. Dictatorships succeed, not because people love them, but because people learn how to live with them. The collapse of German democracy was not inevitable, but neither was it shocking. It followed patterns visible in any society under pressure: fear, fatigue, fragmentation, gradualism, adaptation. This is why the story of 1933 is not only German history, it is a human one. Democracy does not die when people stop loving it. It dies when people stop believing it is essential to daily life, when freedom becomes optional, when silence feels safer, when adaptation feels reasonable. Most people did nothing, not because they wanted tyranny, but because tyranny arrived disguised as normal life. And by the time normal life revealed its true cost, resistance required more than most could give. That is how societies lose themselves, not in a single moment of betrayal, but in thousands of quiet, rational decisions to endure. And that is why the most dangerous words in politics are not hate or violence. They are, "This doesn't concern me." By the summer of 1933, many Germans still believed the word that had saved their conscience: temporary. The emergency powers were temporary. The restrictions were temporary. The silence was temporary. History shows that this is the most seductive lie any authoritarian system tells, because it allows people to surrender freedom without admitting they are losing it. The Nazi regime did not announce permanence. It constructed it quietly, one administrative step at a time. Once the Enabling Act was in place, the legal dismantling of pluralism accelerated with breathtaking speed. Political parties did not fall simultaneously. They vanished sequentially, each disappearance making the next feel inevitable. The Communist Party was already crushed. The Social Democrats were banned in June 1933. Liberal and conservative parties dissolved themselves shortly after, often voluntarily, under pressure. On July 14, 1933, a law formally declared the Nazi Party the only legal political party in Germany. No dramatic announcement, no mass resistance, just another law, passed under authority that had been granted legally. At this point, the idea of temporary opposition ceased to exist. You could no longer wait for political change, because change itself had been outlawed. Dictatorships endure not by ruling from above alone, but by penetrating downward. Independent trade unions were replaced with a single, state-controlled organization. Professional associations were coordinated. Cultural institutions were aligned. Youth organizations were absorbed or eliminated. This process had a name, Gleichschaltung, coordination. It sounded bureaucratic. It was total. The regime did not need to watch everyone all the time. It simply ensured that every social space reflected the same reality. Pluralism did not collapse violently. It dissolved, and once dissolved, it could not be reassembled. Courts continued to operate. Judges wore robes. Verdicts were issued. Files were stamped. Procedures were followed. This continuity reassured many. As long as courts existed, they reasoned, legality remained. But legality had changed its meaning. Judges were not replaced en masse. They adapted. They interpreted laws creatively. They aligned their reasoning with the spirit of the state. They learned which outcomes were rewarded and which were dangerous. Justice became predictive rather than principled. This was not terror justice. It was normalized injustice. And normalization is harder to fight than brutality. The illusion that politics could be avoided did not survive long. Education was transformed. Loyalty replaced curiosity. Culture was purged. Conformity replaced expression. Language was reshaped. Obedience replaced debate. Children were taught not merely what to think, but who they were. The regime understood something fundamental: control the future generation, and permanence becomes automatic. At that point, temporary no longer even sounded plausible. As years passed, many Germans told themselves that it was too late. They had adapted. They had compromised. They had survived. What they had not done was resist. And resistance now required sacrifices far beyond what most could bear. This is the final stage of authoritarian consolidation, the internalization of power. No police officer is needed when people police themselves. No censor is required when fear edits thought. The regime no longer had to prove its legitimacy. It had eliminated comparison. The promise of temporariness had served its purpose. Power had centralized. Opposition had vanished. Institutions had been hollowed out. There was nothing left to expire. What had begun as emergency became permanence, not through declaration, but through exhaustion. Democracy had not been murdered. It had been outlived. The story of 1933 is often told as the rise of a monster. That version is comforting, because monsters feel external, unfamiliar, rare. The truth is more unsettling. What destroyed German democracy was not hatred alone, or violence alone, or one man alone. It was fatigue. It was fear. It was the belief that freedom could wait. Democracy does not collapse when dictators arrive. Dictators arrive when democracy is already exhausted. And the most dangerous moment is not when laws are broken, but when laws are used to justify their own undoing. January 30th, 1933 did not end freedom. March 23rd, 1933 did not end freedom. Even July 1933 did not end freedom. Freedom ended when society accepted that losing it was reasonable, that it was temporary, that it was necessary, that it was someone else's problem. History does not repeat itself mechanically, but it rhymes with terrifying precision. And the quietest warning it leaves us is this: the death of democracy rarely sounds like a scream. It sounds like relief.